So what I'm going to do in the rest of the talk is to talk a little bit about the enactive approach, enactive story. I'm not going to go very, very slowly through that because some things that they are already there in the literature. But I want to focus on the topic of the relations, the borders, the crossings of the borders, which is something that will recur in the talk. And then, if I have enough time towards the end, I want to talk about possible future projects that involve necessarily an enactive and an ecological perspective. But and if there's enough time, I can play a bit of music too. So let's start just going through the idea of agency, which will lead us to an enactive conception of bodies. And for that, you cannot find better where to start than looking at researchers in the ecological tradition. So you see in this paper written in 1994, Has Psychology a Future? Eleanor Gibson saying that one of the hallmarks of human behavior is agency. And she talks about control of an observable event by one's own actions as the hallmark, as the essence of agency. And we have similarly, Edward Reed say the central problem of psychology is to understand how people put themselves in motion, a problem that cannot be described in purely mechanistic language. And behavior is defined as the animal's ability to change its relationship with its surroundings. Now, if you have any familiarity with the work that has been done here with people like Xavier Baranyaran and myself on the definition of agency from an enactive perspective, you will notice that what Reed is saying here is very much the direct definition of agency that we defend. We have a definition of agency that has to do with identifying the minimal requirements that you need to. It's very maybe. Yeah, I'm sorry to be dark. Well, okay. We have individuation here. You cannot barely read this. I'm sorry. It's normativity and asymmetry. We talk about an agent when we are talking about an entity that is self-individuating, that it is related to the environment in an asymmetrical way, and I will explain what that means, and that it does according to vital norms that have to do with its subsistence as an entity. The typical case would be life itself, and we normally use this kind of diagram. You have autopoiesis or autonomy as a self-sustaining process of self-construction and self-distinction in relation to an environment. But as I said, we will have to start crossing some of these borders. And the first point here is that here you can always have a mathematical version of that original picture, which is you have environmental variables and bodily variables or agents variables in a mutual coupling, and you use some sort of a differential equation or something to describe those. To be an agent is to do something else, is to be able to initiate parametrical and constraint and changes in parameters and constraints so as to change the relation to the environment, which is, when you think about it, exactly what Edward Reed said. So this is our definition of agency. But we could try to understand this. This seems a bit abstract, so we can try to understand this a little bit more concretely. So we have this idea of autopoiesis or agency as this minimal characterization of life. And it says that we have two requirements. An autopoietic system is producing itself. It's like molecular transformation that keep producing this bacterium, this cell. And in the doing so, it's building a boundary, is differentiating itself from the medium. Now, when you think about it, these two requirements in the literature, they're not very well specified in terms of their relation. This is just this, you have to have these two conditions. Are they related to each other? Do you expect one when you see the other? That's not very well discussed. What happens is that if you look at them individually, in terms of the relation to the environment, remember, we're looking at those arrows. What is the relation to the environment that would maximize one of these particular requirements. So, for instance, if you have to produce yourself, forget about self-extinction, you have to produce yourself. The best way you can do this is to, everything is food, everything is good for you. Nothing destroys you. But of course, what that involves is opening your boundaries and becoming totally, dissolved into the environment. And if you have to make self-distinction your priority, well, the best way you can do it is to build a wall around yourself. But then, of course, there is no possibility of exchanging energy, matter, or information. But notice, the two requirements that seem to be like just a list are actually related dialectically. One negates the other when you try to maximize it. So you have to resolve this dialectically by extending this tension over time and letting flows in and out and rejecting flows of matter in relation to the environment. That is building a border, a boundary, but not a wall. And this itself is the definition of agency I've given you earlier. It is, you have to regulate your conditions, your relations to the environment normatively, changing the things that are potentially not good for you, taking advantage of those who are good. Notice, just in passing, that this is not a new idea. Here we have Helmut Plessner in this book that just came out. The English translation just came out. This was written in 1928. And finally it came out, where he has, here K is for Körper, M for medium, and he has, we could have a boundary where this is just merely nominal, like an ascribed boundary, and, there is no difference between body and medium. Or you can have a wall, and then, there are no real exchanges. And he says that life is precisely where you have these regulated exchanges of mutual construction between body and medium. I mean, some of you may say, well, the environment is not constructed. Well, we can see, or we can try to get there to see at what point does that have any meaning, or the meaning I want to give it. So, what I'm saying is not necessarily new. But it does highlight that, to me, what is an interesting thing about crossing borders, and it's across the spectrum. You see this everywhere, which is the border and the crossings are dialectically related. There's no conception of border if there is no idea that there would be admitted and rejected crossings, and nothing is a crossing unless there is a border to cross. So the two ideas are connected. The question is, so for instance, a border is different from a limit, or I said a wall, because there is no way you can go past that limit. So the speed of light is as fast as you can go, and you cannot cross that border, at least from what we know. Okay, so it's not a border real. There is no crossing there. So I want you to keep this in mind. We will come back to this. So I told you a little bit about how the organic conception of bodies that are living systems, organic, already moves us into a conception that there is an environment that is constitutively part of the body. The body is made through these interactions with the environment. We can see the same thing, the same story. I'm going to tell the same story again at the sensory motor level. And I'm going to propose here that there is a different form of agency, apart from our organic agency, a different form of body, which is the sensory motor body. And what is it made of? Well, it is made of acts themselves. It's made of the relations of our engagements with the world, with others, with our constructing our environments, and so on. And I'm going to try to defend that idea. But again, I don't think this is a very radical idea, although you might think that, well, when you talk about a body, you think about this thing as if it's lying on the operating table. That's the body. Well, I want to suggest that for our purposes, the idea of a body should be expanded to this idea of enactments, relations with environment. So let's do that. Let's show how that is done. And so this is, sorry, so dark. This is a diagram of a typical sensory motor scheme where each of these segments is a sensory motor coordination. This is the Piagetian notation. Those who are familiar in developmental psychology, where we have a coordination is, if you like, a dynamical meeting of an environmental flow and a bodily flow of processes, which are represented here by this. This is environment, the primes, and the body, the non-prime letters. So this could be the baby learning to drink from the milk bottle. You can have, swallowing and milk. Swallowing and milk coming together, air and breathing coming together, and so on. And this, creates this cycle, which we call sensory motor scheme. It doesn't have to be a cycle, but that's how it typically is represented. So you say, well, that's fine. In that book, and Sensory Motor Life, we elaborated a little bit the formal analysis of the processes of equilibration that take you. The story is not really that relevant at this point, but it was because we wanted to provide sensory motor approaches to perception with a theory of mastery and learning to perceive. But what came out of this is something that I think is more interesting, which is the realization that whenever these things are happening, the sensory motor coordinations are happening, they're not just these isolated events, they're happening with all kinds of consequences that are not necessarily connected to the intentions of the agent or anything like that. I go walking outside and you will hear footsteps. And maybe I'm not intending to create these footsteps, but you will notice that. From that to also walking outside and I'm tiring my muscles, or maybe I'm having a problem with the way I walk. All these influences are leading us to the idea that it's not a good thing to think of actions as isolated. Moreover, and this is an important bit, but I'm not going to go into it too much, you can have influences that recur in a way that they promote the possibility of this scheme being enacted again and again, forming what we call a habit. What is interesting here is that I want us to, start moving away from this myth of the isolated act. And I don't think it's a problem in this audience, but if you look at it in psychology and neuroscience, what we need to explain is just this, person seeing an image, making a decision and pressing a button, and that's like a unit of sense making. I try to convince you that I've been reading the ecological psychologies. So Edward Rick himself says, the activities of daily life are stable clusters of skills. So clusters, that's a nice word. We're not doing the one thing. We are embedded in a kind of sea of possibilities and activities and actions and relations. Very much like, and this has been interpreted in many ways. I'm going to show you an enactive interpretation of this, but you got the rich landscape of affordances, that Eric and Julian have also been defending this idea of the richness of the field of action. So instead of having a scheme on itself, each scheme has consequences whenever it is enacted. It will have consequences for the possibilities of enacting other schemes, either because they are adjacent in the possibilities, like you grab the bottle and then you drink, that's the next bit, or you grab the bottle and give to somebody else, that's the other possibility, or because they have more subtle structural connections. So, doing, there was a title of a paper by Inman Harvey called "Unicycling Helps Your French," and I think it was not exactly about this, but it was like you learn something, other things as a consequence might also improve. So you start forming these clusters, and typically they are related functionally and structurally, forming networks you cannot see. There are some subtle lines there, but never mind. And it's through these networks, these sensory motor repertoires, that when you are located in a particular circumstance and you just act in those, you have all these neighboring schemes that are just adjacent to it. The things that you will choose not to do because that's impossible to do at the same time, or the things that are immediately offered to you because in doing that scheme, the 2 or 3 next options become very salient to you. So it's a very active way. And I want to remind you that each of the circle is one of these meeting of agent and environment. Okay, it's not happening in your brain. It's not something. It's not internal to the agent. Although the structure, as agents, we grow into these sensory motor repertoires. We grow into these sort of structures. I'll mention that a bit more later. Well, you cannot see, but imagine there are lots of lines there. Imagine if you were to put this into I can take a picture of the sensory motor repertoire. And it might look something like this. And why are things colored differently? Well, because really these activities are likely to form clusters. This is what our everyday experience shows us. That when we are cooking, we are in a set of activities that are related to cooking. Cutting, chopping vegetables, preparing the fire, whatever. And they fit together. They have a certain normativity or variability or mutual adaptability between them. But that's very, very different from when you're, commuting. Those activities that you chopping vegetables and so on, it's not even in. How many times do you think about chopping vegetables when you're on the bus? Maybe we do, but not often. The idea is that each of these activities, these clusters describes this micro world, and moreover, they form closed networks. They form closed networks in the sense that they mutually support each other through these relations. If these relations were not there, some of these circles would just disappear. But that is, if you remember, you cannot see. The 3 requirements for agency, we argue in our book, are met at this level. So, again, we find descriptions for this in the work of Francisco Varela. We talk about microworlds, like microidentities. He talks about the switching between microworlds, which is, for an enactivist, a very important question, because that is exactly where functionalism fails. Maybe within a microworld you still have a functionalist explanation, and maybe it will be useful. But the switching between microworlds, he talks about the moment when he's strolling down the street without a care in the world, just looking at the trees, at the people, and so on, and suddenly he realizes he forgot his wallet in the shop that he's just been to, and how the same environment changes meaning completely. The street is no longer this place to, just stroll and look at, but it's essentially what is the optimal route to the shop because I have to recover my wallet. So how does that switch happen? And that's a big question that I don't think we have a very clear answer. There are proposals and so on. Then we have, Roger Barker, similar attempts at describing similar ideas, neighboring ideas, not necessarily the same idea, like behavior tesserae, behavior streams, behavior settings when you focus on the actual setting and its dynamics and so on. From non-enactive or ecological literature, you also see the same convergence to this idea that we are networks of habits or networks of sensory motor scheme. You have the work of Nikolai Bernstein, at the beginning of last century, when he coins this idea of the mutual adaptability of these schemes, and he shows the case of lighting up a cigarette, and he describes like 20 different schemes that are going, and he shows, you cannot. There's some things that you cannot do, like dropping the match before you light the cigarette. But there's still, that doesn't mean that there are rules. There's a sort of organic whole. There are much variability in the possibilities that you can do that. John Fentress, who investigated animal behavior, wolves and rats, he shows that there are these motor relations, for instance, in grooming in rats. And you go into a grooming pattern that follows certain sort of regular activity, not necessarily in a sequence, and exploratory patterns, other regular activities, also not necessarily in a sequence. But during development, a little rat may be exploring in an exploratory pattern, and by chance, it touches its whiskers, and then it falls into the grooming path. It has to do a bit of grooming. So it's like a motor trap. It's like there is a link. These clusters are not fully separated yet, but there is this link still not quite developed as a separate set of activity. And in development itself, Kurt Fischer, he proposes that instead of having developmental stages, we have these developmental webs, where we talk about, and Michael Harvey also talks about networks as schemas, he calls them. Anyway, just to show you that this idea, again, is not a wildly new idea. But it's still an idea worth repeating, because thinking like this makes you think in terms of networks and streams of action as opposed to isolated acts. So they don't exist in isolations, they're streams and networks of schemes. That's what acts are. The idea is that from our enactive perspective, we say that there is a sensory motor kind of agency, which is a bit different from the minimal organical form of agency. When you look at the cluster of self-sustaining schemes, if they fulfill the three requirements, what you have is sensory motor agency. And experientially, phenomenologically, that makes sense, because something I didn't say so much is the very idea of agency is associated with the idea of sense-making, which is associated with experience. In enactive literature, these things are entangled. And we do have norms and experiences and values that are sensory motor. They're not biological in the sense of being about sustaining our biological viability. They may be about a sensory motor demand, being itchy to do something, being sensory deprived and wanting to see some landscape or something. Those are not necessarily directly connected to our biological normativity, understood as the organic level. They are connected to a sensory motor normativity. But to repeat, what is that body? It is exactly what we're doing and how we continue to navigate these networks, and we are making that body as we act. So, sensory motor bodies, therefore, are different from organic bodies. But they're not separate from organic bodies. But we're looking at material overlaps and processes and so on, but two different logics, or two logics, different without meaning this, separate. And a corollary of this, if you buy, as I'm sure all of you do, into the age and environment distinction, is that the environment of sensory motor bodies is different from the environment of organic bodies. Isn't it? I can see the things that matter to me, and they are a mixture of things that have to do with my organic body and my sensory motor body, like drinking water. But the things that are affecting only my organic body, say a virus, triggers an immune response. I don't see that. I don't perceive that. Okay? So I can also, in our particular case of human beings, have a reflective stance on our body and start looking at our body as, touching and touchable. I can this duality that Merleau-Ponty talks about so much. It's like I can see and I can investigate and make decide what is the right way to remove a splinter and so on, as I am looking at objects. Sometimes I can adopt that attitude. So I couldn't do it if I was just this unitary thing. And yeah, bodies are enacted. Moreover, are enacted together, coming to the third part of the enactive presentation before we go to the projects. So maybe many of you probably have heard of the work done with Hannah de Jager on participatory sense making. Again, this is breaking another boundary, the boundary of crossing that border into thinking not just in terms of isolated acts, but networks of acts, well, not just in terms of isolated agents, but agents in connection with other agents, growing together, interacting, and so on. That is the default, rather than the special case. And essentially, the idea is to thematize this idea that there are closures that happen at the interactive level, that interactions can take life of their own, and lots of things can be deduced from them, but I'm not going to go into that a lot now. Only to say that it is again, we don't have an isolated act, we don't have an isolated agent. And to give you an example of how that matters, consider this idea of the field of promoted action, where he says, Edward Reed says, the careful orchestration of where a child is asked to remember something, to repeat an activity, to do something, may greatly facilitate her performance. And it's almost like the social world, the social ecological world will just essentially provide this, prompt for certain forms of development. And a lot of work has been done looking at longitudinal studies in mother-infant interactions in the first year of age. This is some of the people who have been involved in the work I'm going to mention. And we interpret that work in an interesting way, combining the development of your sensory motor agency in interaction. So babies, when they're interacting and playing with their mothers during the first year, around 4 months, these things of course are variable. They're not always the same. These paths are not universal. But many babies, around 4 months, they still show a very synergistic attitude towards the world. So you present them with an object and they just latch on that object and look at it, take it to the mouth. And that is almost as if everything is part of this one cluster. Now, let's deal with this object. And obviously at that point, if the mother is playing, the mother or the caregiver is always trying to prompt a certain kind of, hey, there is another toy here, or hey, look at me. It's trying to separate some of the possible schemes, like you can hold the object, but you can look at this one, and so on, producing a disequilibrium, which through the theory of equilibration and the dynamical interpretation that I didn't go into, you can produce different patterns. Clusters become to be separated. There is a cluster of grasping, or grasping with one hand, grasping with the other. There's a cluster of looking at things, or paying attention to mom, or smiling. But what happens is that these clusters are often, at this stage, at 6 months, still very dispersed. And it's almost like, the infant takes a toy, looks at the mother, he holds the toy, doesn't pay attention to the toy. Well, the mother at this point reverses her strategy and says, you do this first. Now, instead of just changing from one thing to the other, we can now focus a little bit more and try to see let's play with this toy together. And maybe I give it to you, I give it to me, we play a little bit about it. Producing, if you like, a refocusing of these skills, where the clusters now become more and more integrated. They become more differentiated. They become more differentiated, not just being dispersed sensory motor schemes, but essentially new skills. The skill of paying attention to who's calling you, the skill of grabbing a toy with one hand, the skill of looking at it, looking at something else, and so on. So this is how I interpret this idea of orchestration. Of course, I've just mentioned this example which highlights the social interactive dimension, but there was a toy, there was the possibility of having a place to play, time to play, and so on. So there is an environmental orchestration as well. Right, yeah. So yeah, linguistic bodies, and all of this goes into language. Following this scheme. I'm not going to be able to explain this, unfortunately, but what we did in that book is, first part, we tell that story about bodies, essentially. Something I didn't say, these dimensions of embodiment, they're very entangled. They're very difficult to disentangle, and that's why it's often difficult to start thinking purely in terms of organic individuation, or purely in terms of sensory motor schemes and so on. But often, if you already think that there are different dimensions, organic, sensory motor, intersubjective, social, interpersonal, you will start seeing that your body has these dimensions, or there are these dimensions at different bodies, or they're entangled. There is no clear metaphor. It's the kind of thing that we don't have in traditional Western metaphysics, a very clear way of saying, oh, one thing is inside the other, one thing is a case of the other, one thing are two separate things and related. It's very ambiguous. So I didn't mention that, but it's part of the point. And we could, in the question of time, we can go into examples of what I mean by this entanglement. But with this, the idea is to say, can you go, kind of read this, and I don't intend you to read this anyway. Participatory sense making through a series. Remember what we've done with that self-production, self-distinction story, starting with the poiesis, look at the core aspect of this definition, and then look at the intrinsic contradictory elements in it, open them, these contradictions, make them explicit, see what situation resolves it. That's a dialectical step for those who know about or care about that. Well, you do like 8 of these, and you go from participatory sense making to something that we call a linguistic agency. Now we have to be careful here. We call it that because we think that we capture the essence of what it means to be a linguistic body, but yeah, at the end of here you don't have grammar, English, Chinese. It's not. It's more about talking about the embodied essence of that idea. And what comes here is an unresolved tension, which is the incorporation and incarnation of reported utterances. I'm going to say something about this in a moment, because it will go back to the idea of crossing borders. Now, how do we have time? That's fine. So, trust me on this. Linguistic bodies, they are autonomous agents constituted by braided flows of self-directed and undirected reported utterances. I know. If you haven't read all the steps, that doesn't mean much. Never mind that, because I will try to give you an example of what I mean in a minute. And interestingly, a linguistic body is unfinished. We always have this tension between appropriating language. One thing that I'm sure is bad news for all of us, but it's very hard to say anything original. You cannot. So we always adopting forms of speech, of utterances, and so on that already existed, and that's why we use words like words in English, like the word, because they exist and they have been appropriated through these braided interactions throughout the ages. So we appropriate these forms of speech, like so many tools that we have, but utterances have this particularly interesting property, which are not just merely acts, but acts that are person constituting. That is to say, when I address you, there it is. In this joint performance of a speaker and an audience, this dialogue. It is a dialogue in the sense that a dialogue admits for somebody speaking whenever the others are accepting that. I am, in a way, directed towards you. I'm addressing you, or I'm implicitly talking to you, and that is through my actions. I am just, helping you, buttress that process of self-distinction that you have. So yeah, I am here because somebody's speaking to me. So, problem is, if these are the materials that make you a linguistic body, the use of these utterances that already exist, and they are person constituting, what you're doing when you speak is always, to some extent, incarnate other agencies. You're speaking with voices. You're speaking the voices. Your own voice is a little bit of a symphony of voices. Sometimes you hear yourself say something your father would say, or your brother, and you say, oh, that's exactly. And somebody will tell you, that's what your mom would say. And so we're doing this, and this is the tension, because we are making ourselves as linguistic bodies from these skills, these utterances, and at the same time, these are skills that are, they come with little people attached to them in a way, to put it like this. So these ideas, again, relate to the work of people like Mikhail Bakhtin and Voloshinov, the idea of ideologicality and regulations. I'm not going to go, because I want to go to the last part of the talk in a minute, but our interactions are braided in time. So you see, we cross another border now, because we thought we had the isolated act, we have lots of networks of acts. Well, okay, but this is the agent, surely. No, we have a community of agents and interactions and so on. Well, we have language, we just investigate this community and this agent. No, you have a history. You have a whole cultural history that goes to the beginning of time, because these braided utterances are braided through conversations that connect to the very first conversations. So, and this is very dark gentleman. Charles Goodwin's latest book is fantastic in this sense, because he shows you this braidedness in many instances. He calls it cooperative action, and he insists it's cooperative, not cooperative. And in fact, the example he gives is a non-cooperative situation. So somebody named Tony says, why don't you get out of my yard? These are two kids, really. And Chopper responds, why don't you make me get out of the yard? And he shows here how, Chopper is building his utterance out of the parts of the previous utterance. It's just reflecting immediately. I don't need to think of in fact, this structure will conserve the tone, in this case an aggressive tone. Why don't you get out of the yard? It will conserve it, and it will just up the ante. Let's just say, why don't you make me? And for Goodwin, this is the whole of culture, is the interpretation and recombination of elements that are already pre-existent. I pass this because I won't be able to go to that. But incorporation and incarnation, again, is the same thing of having these voices inside that are not necessarily yours. So to conclude this part, before moving into the project part, there's this nice quote by Anne-Marie Moll and John Law, who says that the assumption that we have a coherent body and our whole hides a lot of work. This work is somebody has to do it. You don't have a body that hangs together by itself. You have to keep your body whole. And this is a task of life. This is, again, from an enactive perspective, it's very inactive. You're just doing all this stuff to just keep yourself whole. But it's obviously the case, and it's also in Anne-Marie Moll's work, that you're doing by being in environments, being with others, and being in history, as I said. So I do think I could go a bit quickly over this, because this was the traditional formal part of the talk. The next is the wild part of the talk, where I go like, hey, these are all kinds of things I like to do. And I think these are projects that involve expertise from enactive and ecological approaches. And I think they're important projects, particularly if you're in the idea of not just understanding the world, but changing it. And I'm going to go a bit quickly, but it's just to give you a taste, and maybe there will be more to discuss later. So, understanding diversity of bodies, diversity of places. I think this is a project for both ecological psychology and action. But understanding that from a theoretical perspective, that serves many of the current struggles, that serves to helps people, for instance, in transgender people, in discussions about what is it to become a woman or a man in this case. I mean, Simone de Beauvoir used to say that one is not made a woman when it becomes a woman. Well, a transgender woman would say exactly the same. but these ideas of becomings are different. And what are the elements that are at play here? What are the different dimensions of embodiment? As well as place understanding, whether our places reflect our values and the possibilities of different forms of embodiment. More philosophically, I'm really sorry about that. I'll read that. MSSR says something about this. He's discussing in 1956 something that is relevant to today. So he says, the French Communist Party is asking him for solidarity from people of color and so on. They should all work together for the working class and so on. He says, but we also have a different struggle that has to do with our years of accumulated, oppression and so on. And he writes a letter saying, look, I'm not saying that we have to just disperse into these different, micro struggles. There are two ways to lose oneself: wall segregation in the particular or dilution in the universal. I could not take out of my mind that idea of the wall around the cell or the dilution into the environment. He's using the same words. And he says, my conception of the universal is that the universal is enriched, but all that is particular, a universal is enriched at every particular. So it's a different conception of universal. It's again, going a little bit against the idea that, abstract universals that define metaphysically, this is a human being, belongs into it doesn't belong into it, but throw that away and say each concrete instance builds this idea of universal, and it's an ongoing idea. Atmosphere, soundscapes, memory, hauntings, ecological breakdown. I'm very curious about the idea of hauntings, and especially in the face of degradation. You cannot see little Danny here, the corridor. Sorry for that. But how is it that places, events and enactive, events and relations leave these marks on these places, on these walls, and so on, such that they may still remain there? Or how is it that we have to deal with the loss of landscape, or the loss, in this case, of an ecological environment? How is it that we have, this book, how is it that we have these invoked presences and absences that make a situation eerie or weird? And how is it that we remember as societies? This is a wonderful book, by the way, so embodied, I cannot believe it. So these are, I think this is a project that we have to as, the possibility of bringing together knowledge from ecological psychology and enaction. I won't have time to play the music, sorry. I have to stop in a minute. So, but again, this is done also in soundscapes. You get, while I fit, you get this evocations of hauntings. So this is a track from The Caretaker, project from 2003, where the idea is to evoke the sounds that you will find in the Overlook Hotel. And you see the vinyl crackle. And in other projects like Burial, you also see the tape hiss, playing the role of the noise to create an atmosphere. And it is very haunting. And there are other tracks like that too. And again, these are projects that somehow they are using our very inactive and ecological knowledge intuitively. The creation of spaces, the creation of distances. The Caretaker, Leyland Kirby has projects about mental health too. So the inner spaces that separate you from, your memories and so on. So this is again, we could have the resources that could contribute to understanding this. Labor, bodies, efforts, skills, tools, again, how is it that our bodies produce value? How is it that we do things? How is it that we have constraints that we work towards overcoming? Again, for some weird reason, cognitive science is very silent about this. But there's a lot of work on that is almost just off the shelf. That we could take it and give it an enactive ecological interpretation. about how is it that there is this balance of energy creates value, something that wasn't there before. It just produces something. Another project that I like as a possibility of project is walking or psychogeography, the read. You know this, maybe you heard of this book, Known Places, which describes precisely the places that are very resistant to history, like an airport or a shopping mall. They do not accumulate history on purpose. That's the purpose of this. We don't want history here. We want you to shop or travel quickly, get out of here. What is it that resists that, or what is it that counteracts that? Well, we have knowledge. We have Guy Debord and the reef of the situation is just go and walk into town to get to know it. And in the walking, you're just changing yourself and maybe changing it too. And Walter Benjamin and the idea of the flaneur, you're constituting the commons by just going out there and doing things in it, rather than just arguing that there should be a public space. Well, just go there and make it yourself. And finally, cognitive and socio-material ecologies, and again, another idea of reappropriation or technological disobedience, you might call it. Just do stuff yourself. Learn to circuit bend, your amplifier or your guitar. Like in this, these two channels on YouTube are very show this every day in every video. One is a primitive technology, and the other is a Look Mom No Computer. He's building sound machines out of all bits that he buys on eBay for 10 euros or something like this, and it makes it sound great. Why? Because we have to relearn this idea that our technology is not separate from us, it's us. This happened very much in Cuba in the 90s, the special period. The idea even provided a kind of manual where they put together all kinds of recipes and things like how can you fix your washing machine. Okay, here you can do. If you get these cables and so on, you can fix your washing machine, because people had to do it by themselves. So again, it's this idea of putting together our knowledge to try to move in these directions. And why do I think these are interesting projects? I believe that all of them point to liminal phenomena, things that happen at the borders. They don't happen inside. Mental health is not an issue inside the brain. It's at the borders between environment, societies, history, and biology. So all of them involve a little bit of a different style of knowledge. We're not going to be arguing very fine detail of this definition or that definition. The idea is to do something with this knowledge. Knowledge and action. Good old-fashioned Marxist terminology, praxis. So Bordercrossings, again, I think there's a lot to be learned from doing things together and crossing borders between boundaries, between disciplinary boundaries too. So that's, if you like, the intuition behind the idea of suggesting projects, and I'm sure there are going to be dozens more possibilities that you probably will have yourselves. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
So we have 5-6 minutes for questions.
Thank you. It's a lovely talk. I was captured by your projects also, and I was wondering if you could say a bit about all these kind of projects like fixing washing machines or creating places that are more inclusive. They require skills of making, many of the projects that you were showing. And skills of making are different from linguistic skills, and are also quite different from the typical sensory motor skills that you were talking about. Yes. So I was wondering how in your conceptual scheme the different skills can become integrated, and that also has to do, I think, with the problem of switching.
Right.
And you already said that we shouldn't see the different kinds of bodies as being separated, I understand that.
Yeah.
But is there a way of uniting it?
Yes, that's great. Yes, thank you. Yeah, indeed. I just noticed a very important point, the skills of making. I was thinking of one of the other projects being production, labor, how we can get together to change our environment to achieve a certain goal of transformation. that project probably will have to go parallel or prior to this one, because you will have to really have a good understanding, not just of abstract sensory motor theory that says, okay, you have different skills and different circumstances. Yeah, sure, but more. Say a bit more about the skills of navigating your environment versus the skill of changing something in your environment so that you achieve a different goal. And I think that those two projects will go together, or perhaps the project of... No, they will go together. And that's a nice way to put it. It's a skills of making, yeah. And I don't know whether there is a unity. I don't think there can be a unity of all these dimensions of embodiment and so on, because we are always... But in a way that's not bad. I mean, it is, if you like, the engine that keeps things changing. The fact that we have to deal with these hard to reconcile tensions. When you are, Anne-Marie Mold uses the case of being ill. When you're ill, you have to make all kinds of trade-offs. You have to say, well, I have to go into this diet now, or I can have this pill, or have this injection. Well, no, if I had a pill, it makes me drowsy, so I go for the diet. Oh, but the diet's terrible. So you have to make all this. These are, for her, in her words, enactions, things of changing. And it's because the world is so complex. And you cannot think that there will be a point where all the other decisions will just go in sync together and they will all point exactly in the same direction. I don't think that's possible. But that is the tension of being human, I think. But yeah.
Yeah, but the need to, I understand the multiplicity and the variety, but I think for people in cognitive science, they would typically like to see a way of bringing it together for us to explain them better how it can be all unified in the same person given its history.
Yeah, yes, that's true. I mean, there is an epistemic project, which is we have a science that talks about this, and we don't want to have a science that is split into so many different, the science of, Ezequiel when he goes home, and no, we don't want that. My intuition is that what we'll get some kind of unification or putting together is at the level of the principles that explain. But the application of the principles will always branch out when you look at concrete cases. And in return, the concrete cases may start shifting the meaning of the principle. It's not going to be static, but it may be that, you have a perspective that allows you to go into the problems and then go into the specifics of the problem and decide what is important in that problem, and it's always going to be a decision as a researcher that you make. But it may be that you discover, this idea of autonomy now is a bit expanded into something a bit bigger. This idea of affordance is a little bit changed too. So, yeah, that's where the unification might come, or as from the principles.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I was wondering about some of the modalities you mentioned. So, for instance, I was wondering how linguistic bodies and this idea of linguistic bodies extends to all other expressive behaviors. So I was thinking about facial expressions, gestures, postures, and disposition towards acting in the environment. So how we fit back into the sensory motor schemes.
Right, yeah, sure. When I say utterances over here, obviously that's a problem. I don't necessarily mean spoken utterances, but I mean these acts that are enacted in a social context as part of sustaining a dialogue. And it could be an expression, it could be a gesture, but the way it fits with the sensory motor story is to do with this idea that, when I show you this cluster with so many, and I said agents grow together, these clusters are connected. As linguistic bodies, these clusters become very specifically attuned to each other. So I have all kinds of sensory motor schemes that are for acts that I cannot complete myself, like shaking hands. But I have it because it's a partial act that complements somebody else's partial act. So there's always that coordination issue. and that sensory motor repertoire grows to be a linguistic sensory motor repertoire when my sensory motor schemes are all connected to these conversations I'm having. Moreover, you can go even further and say that from there you can move towards another project that I didn't mention, but it's too much, an enactive idea of truth processes. What is true? What is it to make something true? And it will have to be with the cycles that go through the body of our conversations, our sensory motor understanding of the world and the world. So when I see, look, there's a white car over there, what's happening is either true or not because of how we put together all these cycles. And it may be that if we don't have concepts of color and so on, or that some things are not even true. They're not even make sense. Look, there's a Napoleonic car over there. What does that mean? So we don't have that. So everything makes either true or false. And so we're constructing that idea of truth by connecting the linguistic and the sensory motor and the environmental.
So thanks for your questions. We now have a coffee break, which is in the building next to us, just downstairs. See you back at 11:30.